All right. Well, I think we can go ahead, and I think people are going to keep joining in here. But just wanted to welcome you all and thank you for coming today. A lot of old friends here, but some new faces. So just briefly, if you're not familiar with the Willistown Conservation Trust, we are a nonprofit land trust working to protect land in the Willistown area. We've been at it since the 1970s and have protected 7,500 acres to date. And in addition to land protection, we've developed some other really robust programs through the years, including habitat restoration, watershed protection, bird conservation, and regenerative farming. And through those programs, we strive to model the connection between land, farm, birds, wildlife, and water, and how we can all coexist harmoniously. So I encourage you to check out our website, wctrust.org, to learn more. And for those of you who this may be one of your first Zoom sessions, we ask that you, if you have a lot of noise and whatnot in the background, keep yourself muted. So you're going to hear today from me, Education Programs Manager. I'm Blake Gall, and Mike Cranny, our Preserve Manager, about native plants for your landscape. So we'll do our little spiels. You are welcome to use the chat room. You put your cursor on the bottom of your screen, and you'll see some options pop up there, one of which is the chat, and we'll try and keep up with that throughout the presentation. And then afterwards, we'll have a nice period for Q&A. So we ask that you reserve your questions for the end, jot them down as we go. And then also please know that you will get a follow-up email with a really great list of resources from just if you're just starting to learn about native plants and their importance, a lot of good reading material there, and lists of where you can get native plants in our area, and which native plants to plant for which birds. So you'll receive that in your email. Alrighty, so I'll get started here. Let me do I'm gonna share my screen here. All right. So I like to start this story out with this slide, which isn't very pretty, but it's what we're dealing with today. Our human-altered landscapes are losing their ability to support wildlife and birds. I'm sure you've heard the headlines by now that we've suffered a 30% loss of birds since 1970. And one of the reasons, as you can see, is this is the bird's eye view of America today. You got these largely biologically barren green lawns that really don't function in the food webs. There's 48 million acres of this kind of lawn in the US today. There's 95% of our pristine places are gone. So this represents a great deal of habitat loss. But if we all focused on our patches of land, our little yards, however big or small, Doug Tallamy, author of Bringing Nature Home, suggests that if we all just contributed half of our lawns to this native plant movement and this returning to wild, and ecological function, we could create a homegrown national park of 20 million acres that could really be a substantial part of conservation. So I like to, this is a great slide. None of us are still dressed like this, are we? So why do our lawns still look like this? You know, in the past 50 years, it's amazing all the advances that we've done with iPhones and computers and technology, but yet our yards are still lagging behind. But it is encouraging that all of you guys are here today, and the native plant movement does seem to be catching on a little, which is great. Because as the human population is growing precipitously, we no longer have the luxury of treating our lawns as these museums where we put interesting plants from other countries that don't do much for our environment. So it's time to view our yards differently, and how much more inspirational is it to walk out into your backyard and see a patch of yellow prairie coneflower like this? I love this picture. This is someone's yard in the Willistown area that they've let it go and planted native perennials. And now as we're all spending more time at home, how more joyful would it be for us to be able to have this kind of natural landscape just outside our back door. So not only do native plants increase biodiversity, but they also benefit our own mental health. So let's start viewing our lawns through the lens of ecological function instead of what's culturally accepted aesthetically. So this is actually the front yard of the Willistown Conservation Trust. Looks a little weedy to the untrained eye. This is common milkweed. This is a little milkweed longhorn beetle on the plant. So it all starts with the plants and the insect interactions, really. If you're trying to rebuild food webs, you need to put the right plants in. So plants have developed chemical defenses over time to protect themselves against herbivory. They don't want to be eaten. But our insects, the plant-eating insects, they gotta live. So they have developed enzymes to be able to eat these plants. But that is no easy task. And so over evolutionary time, each kind of insect just specializes on one or two plant lineages. And so many insects and caterpillars, if they have not encountered the plant in their evolutionary history, they can't use it. It's as simple as that. And so that's why the native plants that have been in our area are going to be the best for building these food webs and restoring ecological function. It's good to keep in mind that nature is built from millions of these interactions, these intricate interactions. And the more native plants we put back into our environment, the more of that we restore. This is a picture of, I'm sure many of you will recognize, the monarch caterpillar. The monarchs can only rear their larvae on milkweed. They've developed chemical defenses, they've developed enzymes to be able to eat this toxic plant. And as an aside here, this is the beautiful flower of the common milkweed. And I'll just put a plug in now that it is blooming at all of our, pretty much every one of our nature preserves, Rushton Woods Preserve, Kirkwood Preserve, and Ashbridge Preserve. You can find this. And it is just a hub of life. So many insects use this plant. They're eating it, rearing larvae on it, getting nectar from it 24/7. This plant is a workhorse for biodiversity, and I encourage you to get out and see it. So this is a zinnia. You may see butterflies like monarch nectaring from these non-native plants. The zinnia is native to the arid southwest region of the US, so not native to our region. And yes, they can get nectar from these plants, which is, a great way to support individuals. But you're not supporting the full life cycle because, of course, this insect cannot rear its young on these non-native plants. Even the insects that don't start off as plant munching caterpillars. They need the native pollen for their young. 13 species of native bees use native sunflowers. And we're not talking about like the farm sunflowers you see, we're talking about helianthus sunflowers. So a scientist tried to categorize insect roles into 4 major ones. including wildlife nutrition, which is what we're focusing on right now, driving those food webs. But also decomposing, pollination. 1 in every 3 bites of food you eat depends on the insects. Pest control. One of the things we model at Rushton Farm is native wildflowers all along the farm fields so that we have that natural balance of predator-prey insects, and then you no longer need the pesticides. So insects are hugely important, and they're of course declining. A German scientist discovered a 76% decline in insects from 1989 to 2016. And this is happening everywhere, even in the pristine areas like the White Mountains of New Hampshire. E.O. Wilson famously said, if insects disappeared, the system would collapse into chaos, whereas if humans disappeared, it would just be restored to the rich state of equilibrium that existed millions of years ago, before humans. So whether you like it or not, we need the insects. So if you don't like the creepy crawly ones, let's focus on the cute caterpillars. So caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to animals than any other plant eater. And especially now, birds are really honing in on these caterpillars to feed their young. 96% of our land birds feed their young caterpillars. This is because they're big juicy nuggets. Would you rather go hunt 500 aphids or 2 juicy caterpillars to give to your young? And caterpillars are also full of carotenoids because they eat plants. The carotenoids are important for antioxidants, for immune support, and plumage development in young birds. So Doug Tallamy, author of Bringing Nature Home, did a famous study on chickadees in suburban neighborhoods that were largely introduced plants, and he found there's 75% less caterpillars there. And the chickadees that nested there, they didn't do as well. Their young, their clutches had 29% less chance of surviving. They may have had 1 or 2 less eggs, or the young may have fledged 1 or 2 days later. And this doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at population growth models, it's significant. These birds are having to travel farther to find the caterpillars, to find the few plants in the neighborhood that are supporting caterpillars, or they're having to feed their young higher up the trophic level, like spiders and whatnot that aren't as nutritious. So if we want to support birds and the rest of the food web, you can start thinking about it as caterpillars. Let's support the caterpillars with the plants. And think of their host plant specialists. So I'm not going to get into the plant species too much because Mike's going to do that, but just keep in mind that there are some keystone plant species. 5% of our native species are considered keystone plants that create 75% of the caterpillars that drive food webs. So there's a few things that you can do to get started in this movement if you haven't already. You can start a wonderful little native pollinator garden or meadow in your own yard. You can just plant some native shrubs to get a good start. These I like to show gray dogwood and northern bayberry because they're the bird's favorite. Really fattening berries full of antioxidants and calories that ripen right as the birds are migrating in the fall. Good options there. Even the plants in your lawn that you might consider a weed. They're great native plants like dandelions. This is a picture of a white-crowned sparrow, which actually Marilyn Smith took. She's on this Lunch and Learn today. But we watched this sweet little white-crowned sparrow feeding on the lawn seeds, chickweed and dandelion, for a couple days. This is just a migratory bird, doesn't nest in our area. But a couple days it fueled up on these weeds that we left, these native dandelions and chickweed, and then went north to continue its migration, probably to Canada. So every small thing you do has a big impact. And one thing to work toward is the 70-30 compromise. Going back to Doug Tallamy's research, he discovered that if you have 70% native plant biomass, you can have 30% non-native and still support food webs. So remember, your yard has ecological significance. And with that, I'll go to Mike, Popcorn Mike.
Thank you, Blake.
Yeah.
So just to introduce myself again, my name is Mike Craney. I'm the preserve manager for Willistown Conservation Trust. I'm just going to talk about kind of what we do with native plants on our preserves and how that can translate to your property. So let me just get this presentation going. Okay. So I just want to start out by talking about sort of how we use native plants on our preserves. Oops, sorry about that. So if you look at this quote from our mission, from our organizational mission statement, you see that one of our goals is to preserve and manage the natural resources of the Willistown area, and that really starts with the plants. Blake just talked about, that all of our ecological processes really begin with native plants, and that's what everything depends on to live, to have a healthy environment. So what we do is strive to preserve and rehabilitate and recreate native habitats and plant communities. We have 3 preserves open to the public, like Blake mentioned, and each of those preserves have their own unique habitats and plant communities. So as we manage them,
Uh-oh, looks like Mike froze. Oh, he's coming back.
am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me see.
Darn technology.
I know, I think my Wi-Fi is being touchy. Okay, so anyway. So we're thinking about the different plant communities and plant habitats at our preserves and the different ways that they can have benefits and services to insects and wildlife. So just sort of with that question in mind of how we determine what habitats we want to manage for, we'll just kind of take a look at some of the most common habitats that you might find at our preserves. So first we have meadow. Obviously, it's very beautiful, wildflower meadows. This is a photo from our wildflower meadow at our office. And meadow is very important habitat for insects that depend on these plants, and birds that then will feed on the insects and make their homes in meadows. Unfortunately, this is a habitat that's very endangered in our part of the country, or throughout the country, but in our region especially, just due to development and the loss of sort of the natural processes that historically are what created and maintained this type of habitat, like wildfires or herds of large mammals that would stamp down woody plants and kind of allow that type of environment to thrive. So what we have to do is then kind of go in and manually, as humans, sort of recreate these habitats to make sure that these plants have somewhere to grow and thrive. And we have grassland. This is Kirkwood Preserve, where we have nearly 80 acres of grassland. And sort of for the same reasons that I just mentioned, this is another habitat that has been dying out. But it's a really important habitat for grassland bird species. The meadowlark, for example, since 1970 has had almost an 80% decline in population, due largely to the fact that they're losing this habitat that they depend on. We do have meadowlark populations that nest and breed at Kirkwood in this grassland. So it's really important to have grassland and large swaths of grassland habitat for those species of birds that depend on it. Next, we have shrub, which is sort of an overlooked habitat, something that people don't consider as much, but it is also really important for birds, especially young birds who need it for habitat and food. And again, for some of those same reasons, this is diminishing. It's sort of that intermediate habitat where most things will grow into a forest or just get clear cut and developed. It's also something that people don't know as much about, or they might consider it unattractive or ugly, so they just kind of get rid of it. They don't understand its importance, but it is really important structurally and for the life cycle of birds. And then forest. And when we think about forest, we don't just think about the large canopy trees in the forest. We really want to consider the entire matrix of the forest, from the smaller understory trees to the shrubs, to the herbaceous layer on the forest floor. Unfortunately, most of our forest understories have been decimated by white-tailed deer overpopulation. The deer will eat and kill all of the native understory herbaceous species and young trees and shrubs, and that allows non-native invasive species to come in and invade. So one of our focuses is trying to restore that forest understory, the native forest understory, so that we can kind of get back to that the proper matrix to support all of the life that depend on the forests. So just going back to that question of how we decide what habitats and what native plant communities we want to manage for, it kind of, it depends on a few factors, what is already there in place on the land.
Mike, come back to us.
Lost again.
You're back.
Okay. Sorry. Go away. Is my screen still sharing?
Yep.
All right. Start here. There we go. So, yeah, it just kind of, it really depends on the land that is in place and how, we want to think about some of the habitats that might be needed, like that grassland or that meadow. If we have a property like Kirkwood Preserve where, it was historically farmed, so it's just acres of grassland, we want to then kind of restore that native grassland habitat, use what we have and create that important habitat for the environment. So sometimes then, once we decide what habitat we want to support, we may have to take steps to physically restore the native plant communities. As I mentioned, deer have been are a huge problem, white-tailed deer in this area. And so those native systems don't want to naturally occur. Well, they want to, but the deer won't let them. So there's just a couple examples. Here's a native scrub shrub restoration site at Ashbridge Preserve, where we're trying to restore some of that scrub shrub habitat. And then on the right is Rushton Preserve, where we've planted some new trees and shrubs in the understory to restore some of that woodland structure. And you can see the caging around these to prevent the deer from killing them. So that's one of the things that we're doing to restore the native plants and making sure that they stay alive and are able to thrive. The other part of that then is the non-native invasive plants. So these are a few, particularly troubling examples. You may recognize some of these, hopefully not from your own garden, but they're pretty common. So, but these are some examples of the things that we most commonly come across on our preserves that are invasive. Things like barberry and multiflora rose and burning bush. So, there's kind of a question and a debate about when a plant goes from just being non-native to becoming then invasive. But basically it kind of comes down to, when that plant kind of gets out of control and starts to take up the resources and outcompete the native plants that are supposed to be in those places. And this is what we're seeing from a lot of these species. So a big part of our job trying to manage the native plants is controlling the invasive plants, whether that's cutting them down, removing them. Every so often we have to resort to herbicide. It's sort of a last resort, but for some of these, it's just really what you need to fight them back and allow the native plants to get established. But the best way really to make sure that you're not being overtaken by invasive plants is to get the native plants established to where they're robust enough to outcompete invasive plants. They won't allow the invasives to grow, and you'll have that sort of self-sustaining native environment. So the big question is how this...
Can you go back to that slide? Someone
Yes.
asked if you could name those invasives.
Yes, so let's start. Okay, top left is barberry. And then I'll just kind of go clockwise. So to the right is burning bush. And then you have Asian bittersweet, the vine on the right. Just below that is stiltgrass, Japanese stiltgrass. And then moving left, you have
He's building suspense for what that invasive plant is. Can anybody type in the chat room what you think it is while we're waiting? Oh, there he is.
It's ridiculous. Okay. My internet connection's unstable. Thanks. Okay.
Somebody guessed Japanese honeysuckle. Is that right?
That's right. That's
The
the
one you
vine
left off on?
in the middle. What's
All
that?
right. I had people guess while you were frozen.
Yeah. So yeah, Japanese honeysuckle, that's the vine in the middle there on the bottom. And then to the right of that is stilt grass, and above that you have Asian bittersweet, the vine. The two shrubs on the top are in the middle, that's burning bush, and then barberry on the left. And then below the barberry is multiflora rose. It's got a nice flower, but it's pretty horrible. And then lesser celandine with the yellow flowers. Just a few choice examples of some of, some of my worst enemies at our preserves. But, a few of barberry and burning bush, they're very popular landscape ornamental shrubs, unfortunately, but, they've escaped and sort of naturalized in our native environments where they can really take over and outcompete those native shrubs. So just then coming back to how this translates to your property. So, hopefully we've kind of given a sense of why native plants are important and how important they are. Blake talked about how much lawn we have in the United States and what sort of an antiquated idea that is. This is just an example of a typical front yard, typical lawn. But we kind of want to go from this, normal idea of a lawn to something more like this. This is an extreme example. It just gives you an idea of what you can do, how creative you can be, and the way that you can really support the environment in your own yard. So we'll go back to that question of how do I choose habitat? What habitat do I choose? Well, think about the questions that I kind of talked about for our preserves. What's there already? Do you have some large trees with shade cover? Do you have where you could put a shade garden? Maybe you have some empty open space in a yard where that gets full sun, where you might want to put meadow planting, or just smaller niches around your house where you can do small things, small wildflowers here and there, a native shrub. You might also want to think about whether or not you have sensitive habitat on your land. Maybe there's wetlands in your backyard or a stream passes through, and you want to add plants and protect and emphasize those things. Maybe there's some scrub shrub, which now you know about how important that is, so you could start to restore, maybe emphasize that. And it always comes back to what you want to get out of it. So you want something that looks good. You want to plant for something that is attractive. Maybe you want to attract birds or pollinators. The good thing is that to plant, when you plant an array of native plants that will be blooming throughout the season, that's good both for appearance and for the pollinators who depend on them. So you kind of kill two birds with one stone. Sorry, Lisa, like with that. So yeah, just some examples. If you for a meadow planting, maybe you have open space and full sun. You can replace lawn or traditional garden beds. If you want to look at scrub shrub, it's good for a border. Maybe you have some established native shrubs, or you have a non-native hedgerow that you want to replace. And this is one of the things that we do with management as well. When you're talking about habitat like scrub shrub, where that structure is so important for the birds, it's something that you really want to replace in steps. You don't want to completely.
While he's frozen, I'll just, that scrub shrub they've really discovered is important for Even interior woodland nesting birds like ovenbirds and wood thrush, the young, shortly after they fledge, will seek out these scrubby areas because they're a little more sheltered from predators than the woodlands, and they're just full of all kinds of good insects and berries and whatnot to eat. So Cornell Lab of Ornithology really championed some like geolocator studies of fledgling birds, and really were the ones to flag this as super important habitat that gets overlooked. Hey, Mike, you're back.
Thank you, Blake. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you said it better than I could have.
Somebody said, someone in the chat said they thought maybe if you close down your video, it could maybe stop you from freezing. I don't know if you want to try that, but.
Could try it. But yeah, and I just wanted to emphasize the point that about restoring native scrub shrub. Sorry, I lost my video. Stop video. Okay. It's something that we try to do in steps because the birds depend on that habitat. So you don't want to remove it all in one fell swoop and eliminate the habitat that they depend on. So what we do is try to sort of gradually, remove non-native shrubs and replace them with natives, just so we can maintain that structure for the habitat that the birds depend on. And then shade gardens, if you have areas where you have full or partial shade, maybe again you have tree cover. I just want to make the point that in Chester County, 480 out of 511 species of caterpillar that survive on oak trees, that's about 94% of them will, when they're ready to pupate, fall to the ground and build their cocoons either in leaf litter or burrow into the ground. So they really depend on sort of that structure, that understory structure underneath the trees. So, filling in turf or mulched areas under shady trees is a great way to, with a shade garden is a great way to support those caterpillars. So let's just talk about some specific species that you can use. I know this is what a lot of you are interested in hearing about. Again, Blake mentioned the resource guides that we're going to be sending out, and they have lots of great suggestions and great ways for you to kind of find out what you can use. But I'll just make some suggestions, give some examples, just to get you going, give you some ideas. Blake talked about the idea of the keystone species. Here are just the raw numbers. Again, this is just in Chester County, the number of species of caterpillars that these species of trees and flowers support. So it just gives you a sense of how important some of these native species are to the environment. So I'm going to go through some good native alternatives for common landscape yard species that you see a lot. So just starting with some of the trees. Some of the larger landscape trees that are non-native and invasive, like Noro maple, Bradford pear, Japanese Zelkova, you can replace with some of these species. River birch or some of the other birch like gray birch, sweet birch are a great alternative. Sugar maple has really good fall color and great structure. Black willow is one of those keystone species that's really good for the caterpillars. And oak, obviously white oak, other oaks like red oaks are all great alternatives. And then some of the smaller, more ornamental landscape trees like your Japanese maple, saucer magnolia, Yoshino cherry. These are very beautiful trees, but again, not providing those services that some of the natives do. As a Penn State fan, it's hard for me to recommend Ohio buckeye, but for the 37 species of moths and butterflies that it supports, I will make that recommendation. It's a good tree. Serviceberry is a beautiful flowering tree that flowers early in the spring. American hornbeam is a great sort of understory tree that has really nice bark and great fall color. And then trees like chokecherry and bird cherry are really beautiful as well. Some of the native dogwoods like Florida dogwood, pagoda dogwood are all great sort of smaller trees that can replace some of those non-native ornamentals. Okay, and some of the shrubs. I talked about burning bush and barberry. Honeysuckle shrub, more honeysuckle is another very invasive shrub. And here's some more examples of things you can replace them with. Strawberry bush is the native cousin of burning bush. It has these really pretty berries that kind of burst open in the spring. That plant's also called hearts of bursten due to those really nice berries. Winterberry holly is an awesome shrub. It gives really nice winter interest, those bright red berries. Spice bush is really nice, gives really nice yellow fall color and really beautiful yellow flowers in the spring. And then fragrant sumac has really nice, you can see the fall color there. And it's called fragrant sumac because in the summer when you crush the green leaves, it gives off a lemony scent. So those. Some of the more some of the showy flowering shrubs like Asian hydrangea, snowball viburnum, you can replace with some of the native viburnums and hydrangeas.
Mike just likes to give everybody some time to process what he has just been talking about. Nanny berry.
Come back.
Rose, oh, that's a cool one. That's over at Ashbridge Preserve.
At least it's letting me back in. Am I back? Yes, rose mallow is a great native hibiscus. It likes wet areas, or so yeah, in our wetlands at Ashbridge you'll find that. And then okay, I'll move on to the flowers. So rather than there's too many examples of flowers to name, so I'll just all the old boring perennials that you get from Lowe's and Home Depot, get rid of them. You can replace them. These are just some of the examples of, we mentioned those keystone species, the sunflowers, asters, and goldenrods. These are just a couple of native examples of those. You can see the beautiful colors that you get with those. Some other favorites of mine are phlox, bee balm, blazing star, cardinal flower. And you can really just, there's so many choices that you can go with and play around with. And then the grasses. You don't want to forget about the grasses. And these are some native warm season grasses that can be a great accent to your garden. It's a great way to fill in space, add different layers and textures. These are some of the nice sort of meadow grass examples that we have. We have some of these planted at Kirkwood in some demonstration areas. So that's just always something else to think about and ways to add to your garden. And again, we want to rethink that typical garden design. You have these sort of typical pictures, conventional plantings where you have everything spaced out. You have 3 or 4 species if you're lucky. And for some reason we have this idea of adding mulch. And I don't know who decided that we wanted to look at mulch, but I would rather fill that in with more plants, more flowers, and fill that space in. We have more images like this, where you get those different species of native flowers, all the colors, everything growing together, creating that really beautiful texture and structure in the garden. So that's just sort of something that you can think about and ways that you can change and improve your landscaping. And then just a little bit about management. We have some great resources on our website, and again, we'll be sending those out in an email. We have resources that kind of go step by step through creating your own meadow garden and your own shade garden, and a great resource from our bird team called Beauty in the Brambles that talks about shrub. So that'll really just take you step by step through kind of creating these habitats. For a lot of these things, it's a lot of early maintenance. You don't want to get those things established. Mowing meadows occasionally and then once a year, making sure that you keep out the invasive plants. But then, once you get that stuff established, it's really just about sitting back and watching nature do what it does. And it really becomes something where if you have this native structure to your gardens, it's gonna support itself and take care of itself much better than any typical non-native store-bought ornamental plants in your garden will do. So it really saves on maintenance costs and the physical labor that it takes to maintain that old idea of lawn and garden. And here's just some more inspiration. These are just pictures from Ashbridge, some of the scrub shrub, and our native wildflower garden at our offices. You can always come by and walk through our wildflower garden, and just come by our preserves for inspiration. You can go through the woods at Rushton. You'll see great understory species of ferns and spring ephemerals in the spring. The meadow plantings. We have a nice shade garden at our offices, a rain garden at our Rushton Conservation Center at Rushton Preserve. So anytime you need inspiration or ideas, come by to the preserves, check it out, reach out to us with specific questions, and have fun with it. And this is just a plug for our event next week. Blake, if you want to talk about this.
Yeah, this is, we're hoping to get some children on this Nature at Night virtual event. Children and children at heart who are interested in fireflies and the other insects that enchant the night. I'll be chatting about them. You can sign up on our website. That's our little plug for our next event. So let's go to the Q&A session. So Mike, we had a question in the chat room about if you had any rain garden suggestions. And other than that, you guys are welcome to unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, so rain gardens, another great alternative for the simple typical gardens that you have at home. Like I just mentioned, we have a new rain garden that we put in place outside our Rushton Conservation Center. It's a lot of those similar meadow species that like to have their feet wet. So things like there's some Rudbeckia species and penstemon, things like that, and we could.
Swamp milkweed's beautiful.
Yes, the swamp milkweed, which is and the butterfly weed.
Yeah,
they're both blooming now, so definitely check that out. And some of those resources that we're sending out, they have great suggestions and just lists of plants that fit each niche that you can use for situations like that.
Mm-hmm. And I want to say it is important to remember, if you're doing a wildflower meadow or a little pollinator garden, Mike mentioned don't forget about the grasses, and that is important, especially now since we're living in an environment with so many invasive plants. The grasses have a thicker, they've got a wider root ball, so they can help outcompete. They can help you with some of those weeds if you put the grasses in amongst the wildflowers. The wildflowers tend to, like the milkweed, will stick a taproot down like 8 to 12 feet into the ground, and they're literally mining groundwater, whereas the grasses spread out a little more, which can help with the invasives.
And that's the thing about these meadow species, is these native species have evolved and grown up together, for centuries, millennia, and so they can coexist.
Ah, darn. Poor Mike. I'm not sure how to finish that sentence of his. Oh, there he is. I was really trying hard to tap into your mind and figure out what you were going to say. But it wasn't coming.
What was I saying? Oh, the native meadow species that have evolved together, they are able to coexist like that where they evolve together so they can cohabitate, and grow together. You talked about their roots, and that's just something that some of the, you stick non-natives together from Asia, from Europe, some from the United States, and they don't have that same cohabitation, and that's just something unique and specific, and it, it's just kind of obvious. Like, of course, they're from the same place. That's what they do, and that's what sort of enables you to have a meadow with such full structure like that.
We have a couple questions in the chat. What can we do about invasive bugs like the lanternflies?
That's a great question. They're everywhere. The nymphs are out in force. It seems like we're just getting more and more. I mean, the best thing to do is kill them whenever you see them. I see some suggestions about soda bottles. I just saw a great video today on Twitter. I forget, it might have been on Natural Lands tweeted it, but just using a water bottle with some soap and water and just knocking nymphs into that, and that'll kill them. People use the sticky tape around the trees, but I think Blake would agree that that's not ideal. There's been documentation of birds getting trapped, or maybe small squirrels. So I think the easiest and best thing to do is to find the egg casings over winter. It's the easiest way. You find the egg casings on trees or on stone. They like smooth, flat surfaces for their egg casings. So, and if you scrape those off, then they can't breed. But they're quick, and there's a lot of them. So to find them all and kill them all when they're young or when they're fully grown, it's what you kind of have to do. But I think the easiest and most effective way is to overwinter when they're not running around and jumping out of the way, to scrape those egg casings.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's probably just something that we'll be living with for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, hopefully, the more that we can support the health of our ecosystem in our yard, the more you can focus on biodiversity, putting those plants back in there to support the insect species, then hopefully maybe there'll be an insect or a bird that decides it can eat them, or some balance will be struck. But I think the structure needs to be in place, so that's what we all need to be focusing on. And that's done through conscientious decisions of the plants that you put in your yard, and the nurseries that you're supporting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions? You guys can just shout it out. Don't be shy.
Dick has a question.
Who has a question? Oh, maybe there's stuff.
No.
Oh, okay. Anything we didn't touch on that you guys?
Yeah.
Do you guys, are you guys all native plant people here today? Do you all have native plant gardens? Or, yeah, you guys give a thumbs up like Andrew did.
No one knows.
Or do we have any newbies that you're just learning about native plants? Unfortunately, I always say this is something that they should be teaching in schools, because it's just this, it's this very important, this connection that we have with nature in our yards is so important. But I don't blame people for being totally out of the loop, because you go to Home Depot or Garden Center and you want to get plants for your yard, and you just get the pretty ones. You don't know about all of the intricate connections that we've been talking about, unless you have a gardening hobby or somebody mentored you. So, what's that, Andrew?
I was just going to say, maybe if somebody has a favorite native plant that they'd like to share with the group and what they like about it.
Yeah.
I love moss phlox. I put it into the chat. It's a great one for dry, sunny spots, I have it at the edge of my stone wall, and it sort of grows over the edge, and it doesn't need water and gets these really pink, pretty pink flowers in the spring. It's a great one. It's indestructible. It just gets bigger and bigger every year.
I was going to say the same thing, Andrew. That's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and in turn, you'll get this on the list, but in terms of places to go for native plants nearby, there's Redbud Native Plant Nursery. That's probably our favorite in Media. Mastardi Nursery just opened again. I'm not sure if they have a big selection because they've been closed, of course, for the past few months, but they have a small native plant selection. And there's actually a lot of interesting online sources like New Moon and some other online marketplaces that will give you guys. So, and hopefully the more we start, voting with our purchasing power, the more of these nurseries will start providing these native plants to sell, and the more people will get on board.
Yeah, exactly.
Where do you buy your moss flocks?
Before I worked for the Willistown Conservation Trust, I worked at the Schuylkill Center for Environmental Education, and I ran the native plant nursery there, and we'd have moss flocks every year. And the Schuylkill Center still has a native plant nursery, and you might be able to get it from them. It's not totally common, like Redbud might have it. You just have to check around. A friend of mine has Good Host native plants, and he has a lot of the harder to find native plant species.
There's a mail order. There's not a mail order company that's on our list called izelplants.com, and they are the retail outlet for what's the wholesale place that we use, Blake?
North Creek.
Yeah. So anyway, you can buy entire flats of native plants from izelplants.com, and I just went on their website, and it looks like they have moss flocks, but I like to buy huge quantities so that I can have larger mass plantings. And so that izelplants.com is a great resource for if you're patient and you're willing to start out with plugs, you can get 50 plants instead of 1 or 2.
Can you spell that, please?
IZEL plants.com.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. I just recently heard about that from Marilyn Smith, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good one. But then there's a lot of great books. If you haven't read, we mentioned Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy. He's got a new one out called Nature's Best Hope. Thanks, Mike. And then there's ones that are even more focused on design aspects, like The Living Landscape by Richard Dark and Doug Tallamy. That's a beautifully done book. They've got some interesting methods of doing things, because of course Mike mentioned you have to watch out for deer. With the native plants are favorites of deer, unfortunately, which is a lot of the reason why you don't see so many native plants in our understory anymore, because the deer focus on that and leave the invasives, giving the invasives even more of a toehold. But like Doug Tallamy and Richard Dark suggest pairing plants. So like mountain mint is a great native that supports all kinds of pollinators, beautiful, soft, velvety leaves, and a little white, delicate flower. But if you intersperse that with your other native plants that the deer like, since they don't like the mountain mint, it's somewhat of a shield. Nothing's 100%, but so there's all those things to consider.
Yeah, someone asked about whether any of these are sold at Rushton, and they did have a.
I think Mike was going to say they had a native plant sale, but we're not really aside from once a year, we're not a great source to buy them from, but we're a great source to model these landscapes, the native wildflowers. You can go go to whoever asked about the rain gardens. We have a beautiful one right in front of our new Rushton Conservation Center. If you haven't been there, I urge you to check it out. That's on Delchester Road. And then off of Providence Road is the one you saw in a couple of our slides. And that meadow, it's like an acre, 1.5 acres, maybe not even. And it's just spectacular to walk through. We have mowed paths through the meadow so you can enjoy all the different parts of it. And that was done by plugs over the years. We had school children come and plant plugs a foot apart that we ordered from North Creek Native Plant Nursery. We ordered between 800 and 1,000 plugs each spring. And in April, the kids came and helped us plant these guys. And so there's sort of a patchwork that you can see at the trust of this meadow. We did different patches throughout the years to make it manageable instead of doing the whole thing at once. So it's neat to see that. And then to see the more wild meadows, you can wander the paths of Kirkwood. There's a lot of native milkweed, and then Ashbridge. Later in the summer, you'll see that beautiful mallow hibiscus that Mike showed. So that's what we specialize in, showing these native landscapes.